Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Food for Thought. My name is Alex Colvin, and I'm the Public Programs Curator here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Our 2022 Food for Thought lecture series is made possible through a sponsorship in the name of Mike Jenkins IV. Before we begin our program today, I have a few quick announcements. This week, we opened a new temporary exhibit, Changing the Course, Art by the Currently and Formerly Incarcerated, which is on view in the Milo B. Howard Auditorium and our second floor lobby. Our next research rundown will be virtual on our Facebook and YouTube channels, and will premiere on March 7th at noon Central Standard Time live. And our next Alabama Women's History series on Alabama suffragists will be March 9th at noon Central Standard Time here on our Facebook and YouTube channels. And finally, our Food for Thought series will continue next month on March 17th as John Allison presents on Leela Seton Wilder Emerson. Now, we are optimistic that we will be able to return to a hybrid of in-person and virtual programming next month, but please keep checking our social media page or our website. You can also sign up for our emails from the archives to be able to keep up to date on our programming and our building. And I'll put a link in the comments below so you can sign up for the emails. Without further ado, I am very happy to introduce today's speaker, Karen Gray Houston. Ms. Houston was born in Montgomery and raised in Cleveland, Ohio. She graduated from Ohio University with a degree in psychology and earned a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. Houston is an award-winning broadcast journalist, retiring after 41 years as a news reporter at radio networks and television stations in Boston, New York City, and Washington, D.C. She's the author of Daughters of the Boycott, Carrying on a Montgomery Family's Civil Rights Legacy, which is available in our online bookstore, and I'll provide a link below so that you can purchase it. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Karen Gray Houston. Welcome.
Hi, Alex. Big thank you to you and to the Alabama Archives Department for hosting me. You know, I did a lot of research on my book at the archives. Glad to be here, albeit virtually, to share some food for thought. Now, at a time when there's all this talk about banning and burning books, I'd like to say that I think you should read books because we can learn a lot from history, from books, which of course brings me to my book, Daughter of the Boycott, Carrying on a Montgomery Family's Civil Rights Legacy. It's a memoir. For me, it was very personal. I wrote this book as a tribute, really, to my father, the late Judge Thomas Gray, and his younger brother, civil rights attorney Fred Gray, for the really important role that they played, along with some unknown, unsung heroes and heroines who helped to really fight and bring down Jim Crow in the Deep South. In the book, I take the reader along on my own personal journey of discovery of what happened during the 1955 bus boycott, things I did not know, even though I was born in Montgomery and experienced segregation firsthand. You know, more than 6 decades ago, Black people were not allowed in white hotels, restaurants, schools. They even set aside water fountains that were specially for white people. So what my parents and my family lived through was legally sanctioned, government-sponsored segregation, the separation of the races by law. So what I'm going to do today is show you some pictures. They're mostly family pictures, so I can it'll help tell my story. I remember as a little girl, my mom dressed us all up, my 2 brothers, that's Thomas Jr. on the left, the tall one, and Frederick, dressed us up all one day and said, I'm going to take you guys on your first bus ride. And, you know, Juanita Gray was, look at her, a real beauty. She was a special spirit. She marched us down the street a block away to a bus stop. And she told us she wanted us to sit right up front behind the white bus driver. Juanita Gray wanted us to know as little Negro children what it felt like not to have to sit in the back of the bus. Now, all of that came about, fortunately, with the assistance of my father, that's Thomas Gray over there on the left, and his youngest brother, Fred. But before that, I think the stage was really set for the bus boycott 5 years before because of a man named Hilliard Brooks. Now, Hilliard Brooks was a Black man who was trying to get a ride on a bus in downtown Montgomery on Dexter Avenue. He was shot and killed by a white police officer. Now, according to this Justice Department report, the white police officer arrived to handle a complaint of drunken disorderliness. And nobody will argue that Hilliard Brooks wasn't drunk and disorderly. According to the Justice Department, the police officer got on the bus, took his club, hit Hilliard Brooks with the club, and then as Brooks was trying to exit the bus, he shot him, and Hilliard died later in the hospital. There's a little dispute about exactly what happened. According to eyewitness accounts at the time that were reported in the local newspaper, the incident happened off the bus. Hilliard Brooks had gotten off the bus, and when the police officer arrived, he knocked Hilliard Brooks to the ground and shot him when he tried to get up. My dad knew Hilliard Brooks. They played street football together. They were both veterans of World War II. This is my dad in the picture. Dad was in the Navy. Hilliard Brooks was in the Navy. I don't think they knew each other at the time. But when my father found out that Brooks had been shot and that Officer Mills was let off the hook, he decided to wage a major protest in downtown Montgomery. He got together a lot of veterans. They marched down Dexter Avenue. They held these signs that said ballots will beat bullets. And they were encouraged to go down into the courthouse where you could register to vote at the time. Sound familiar? White police brutality. I could rattle off a whole laundry list of names: Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, some recent names, Amir Locke in, where's that? Minneapolis. I'm trying to think of the names now. Jason Walker, I think that's a recent one. And here, this was in 2016, Greg Gunn. Greg Gunn was a Black man who lived in the neighborhood I used to live in as a child, Mobile Heights in Montgomery. He was leaving a card party, going home, and a white police officer saw him and thought he looked suspicious. 2020, in Atlanta, another inebriated Black man with the last name Brooks, his name was Rayshard Brooks, another one killed by a white police officer. In the Greg Gunn case in Montgomery, I remember walking through the Mobile Heights neighborhood. A lot of people had signs up in their yards that said, "Justice for Greg Gunn." It took years for justice. The police officer who was involved in that case, Aaron Cody Smith, was kicked off the force. He was eventually convicted of, but not of murder, of manslaughter in a trial that was held outside of Montgomery. They changed the venue. And he appealed his conviction, but I checked recently, and apparently Greg Gunn, an appellate court, and this is kind of a surprise, an appellate court upheld his conviction. So back on the bus, Claudette Colvin was arrested. She was a teenager in Montgomery, age 15, on March 2nd, 1955. She was on a crowded bus with a bunch of her friends from high school, Booker T. Washington. She refused to give up her seat to a white woman on the bus. There was no boycott for Claudette Colvin after she got pregnant. What you all know is the case involving Rosa Parks. It happened 9 months later. Rosa Parks was portrayed by the media at the time as someone who was a subdued, quiet seamstress. She was tired on the bus that day. But Rosa Parks was an activist. I like to say she was a warrior, and she was waiting for that opportunity. Rosa Parks was a secretary of the NAACP, the local branch. She headed up the youth council of the NAACP. And at the time, she met my Uncle Fred at NAACP meetings. They were kindred spirits. They both hated the idea of segregation and wanted to do something about it. And they started having lunch to talk about what they were going to do. At the time she was arrested, there were 40,000 Black people living in Montgomery. That was 1955. For the most part, almost none of them rode the buses for 382 days. After she was arrested, my dad got involved with the Montgomery Improvement Association. He was on the board of the group that coordinated the day-to-day activities of the boycott. They organized a massive carpool operation, and my dad could be seen riding his Plymouth every day to pick up Black passengers to keep them off the buses to make the boycott a success. And that's my brothers and me in our backyard with my dad's car. My father was also a businessman at that time. He and one of his friends from college and a neighbor who lived across the street from us, William Singleton, owned a radio, TV, and appliance store called Dozier's. It was across the street from Loveless High School. And years later, my dad liked to brag about the fact that he sold a washing machine and some TV sets to Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife, Coretta, when they first moved to town. Dad also had a side gig as a radio announcer. He was hired by A.G. Gaston, who was the first Black millionaire in Alabama. And he was on the radio at a time when Black people, or Negroes as they used to call us at the time, would get up in the morning when they were frying their eggs and bacon. They listened to the radio because they wanted to find out where the mass meetings were. Mass meetings were like pep rallies and fundraisers for the boycott. And they would listen because they wanted to know, they wanted to hear where Reverend King was going to be so he could tell them about what was going on. Now, my uncle, Fred Gray, was the attorney for the boycott. He represented Rosa Parks, he represented Martin Luther King, and that case involving Claudette Colvin, he took that case all the way to the Supreme Court. And it was in late 1956 that the Supreme Court ended segregated busing in Montgomery. So he won that case. It was a case he had filed that was called Browder v. Gale. Now, over the years, my father expressed great joy in the role that he played in that boycott. And one day he took our family down to the city jail and this was in their basement. You can see all those boxes in the background. We were looking over the arrest records and the boycott mugshots. I think my dad's picture is down there. He was one of 89 people arrested during the bus boycott. And he wore that arrest like a badge of honor for the rest of his life. I like to say that segregation did not stop at the Mason-Dixon line, and it did not, neither did my dad's activism. So after the boycott was over, he moved our family up north to Ohio. Dad, like my uncle, wanted to go to a state where they would admit Black people to law school and get a degree. He did that. However, for whatever reasons, Montgomery officials would not allow him to pass the Alabama bar while my Uncle Fred was down in Montgomery desegregating everything that needed desegregating in the state of Alabama. So my dad ended up having a remarkable decades-long career as a civil rights attorney in Cleveland. He was known for his practice of civil rights law, fair housing, and anti-poverty law. And Cleveland, like most of the big cities up north and around the country, had an ugly habit of steering Black people towards ghettos. And so my father litigated against that and was recognized for his activism over the years. He was recognized in Montgomery posthumously during the 60th anniversary of the bus boycott. And here you can see this picture is on the wall at his alma mater, Alabama State University. Now, ironically, after many, many years, my father and my mother moved back to Montgomery, but that was because my father received an appointment as a federal administrative law judge in the city in Montgomery that would not have admitted him to practice law back in 1955 when he wanted to do that, or in the 50s or early 60s. I always used to wonder why they wanted to move back to Alabama, but I think as I look back on it, they felt somehow responsible for a lot of the change that had occurred over time. My family stayed in touch with Rosa Parks over the years. That's Rosa Parks and my dad at a dinner at my Aunt Pearl's house in Montgomery. They were all friends and stayed in touch. Unfortunately, as you know, Rosa Parks has passed away, and so has my dad. But my Uncle Fred is still out there talking about the importance of what happened in Montgomery in 1955 and being honored for the role that he played in it. He too went up north, and this was before my dad, to go to law school where Negroes were admitted. And he had a secret plan, a mission. He was on this mission. My uncle was a man on a mission. He was going to go up north, get this law degree, go back to Montgomery, pass the Alabama bar, become a lawyer, and destroy everything segregated he could find. And he did. He filed lawsuits that ended segregation in public transportation, public education, juries, how you can, the list goes on and on and on. And of course, there's a marker, a historical marker for my Uncle Fred on one of Montgomery's major streets, Dexter Avenue, downtown. This is actually in front of a place where he used to have an office, and it is now home to the Alabama State Supreme Court. When I look back on everything that my family did during the civil rights era, it reminds me of something that Barack Obama once said, that ordinary people in local communities can do extraordinary things. My dad was so proud of Barack Obama that he went out and bought Obama's book, The Audacity of Hope. And one Christmas, he gave copies to all of his friends. My dad could not believe that in his lifetime he would ever see a day when a Black man would be elected president of the United States. And here are the Gray siblings, ordinary people who did extraordinary things. That's on the left there in the red tie. That's my uncle. Born Samuel Gray, he rejected segregation and everything that was happening in Montgomery and moved away. Became a Muslim, changed his name to Hassan Gandastani, became an educator and a psychologist, spoke Arabic and some other languages, I'm told. There's my dad, Pearl Gray, their sister, was also an educator. She's and an author. She wrote a book about our family church in Montgomery, the history of the church, and also about my Uncle Fred. That's Hugh Gray, who another businessman in the family. He had Gray's flower shop. He was a florist, a successful florist in Montgomery until he passed away. And then there's my Uncle Fred. So they would probably take issue with me if I told you that they were ordinary people. But the irony of it all is that the Gray family, the Gray siblings came from very, very humble beginnings. They grew up on a street named Jeff Davis. They lived in a house that did not have hot and cold running water. They read by the light of kerosenes. And this picture right here is of my grandmother, Nancy Jones Gray Arms. And that's Fred sitting down on the steps of that little store in front of her house that my grandmother ran. By the way, that street, Jeff Davis, the part of it they lived on was West Jeff Davis Avenue, has a new name now. It is now Fred D. Gray Avenue, after a renowned civil rights attorney. So my Uncle Fred, I always called him Uncle Teddy. I did as a kid. It was his nickname in college. Dad called him Teddy. I, to this day, call him Uncle Teddy. And so do some of my friends now. He is still practicing law. He goes to his law office every day in Tuskegee. During the 65th anniversary of bus desegregation in Montgomery, which was a big anniversary, he turned 90. He is now 91 years old and still going strong. I went back to Montgomery, a lot, but I was back there in 2015 for the 60th anniversary of the boycott. And I wanted to talk to some of my old neighbors and friends. And I got them together in front of, this house is the house I lived in as a little girl. It's on the corner of Mobile Drive and Tuskegee Circle in Mobile Heights. I wanted to get a sense of what had changed in Montgomery. And I did that by talking to them. Frank Taylor, the guy in the wheelchair who used to live down the street, unfortunately is no longer with us. I joined a civic organization while I was doing the research on my book called One Montgomery. And they have breakfast meetings once a week. They bring in newsmakers and politicians and people to talk about what's going on in Montgomery. And it's a group that was born out of some racial strife that happened in Montgomery back in the 1980s. And I guess the theory or the thought of it is, if only Black and white people of color could sit down at a table and have conversations over a meal, maybe we could avoid some of the racial confrontation that we're seeing. Well, the first day I did that, I made the announcement that I wanted to talk to anybody who could help me with my book that I was researching on the bus boycott. And as soon as I sat down, this woman right here, Sally Mosier, was sitting at my table, and she leaned over and says, you're going to want to talk to me. Her father was the racist police commissioner during the Montgomery bus boycott. And Sally told me some very revealing things about her dad. I met with Vera Harris and Velda Harris Montgomery. They lived 3 doors down from the King Parsonage on South Jackson Street. And the day somebody tossed a bomb on King's porch, the windows at their house rattled and shattered too. And Velda's dad, Vera's husband, Richard Harris, moved the kids' bedrooms to the back of the house after that. And he was somebody who was very active in the movement. He had a drugstore downtown, and the civil rights leaders would gather down there and meet, and people who were waiting for rides to work, taxi rides or carpool rides, would meet outside that drugstore, hoping not to get arrested or whatever. I sat down with this lady, Anne Carmichael. She was a well-to-do white woman who had a maid during the bus boycott, and she told me she had to figure out how to get, she called it, the help, how to get the help to work. And, so that she wouldn't be riding the buses. I hate to tell you this too, but Anne Carmichael has also, I'm told, recently passed away. Her maid, who she introduced me to, Christine Callaway, when I first dropped by her house to visit, Christine told me that her feet still hurt from all that walking that she did during the bus boycott. If you want to know anything about anything that's going on in any town, you should go to a barbershop. So I went to Nelson Malden's barbershop. He was Martin Luther King's barber. he was much younger at the time. Malden was going to Alabama State College. It was now Alabama State Teachers College for Negroes was the name of it at the time. I stopped by what was called the Malden Brothers Barbershop with my husband, Robert Nesbitt, and my husband went in to meet, to make the introduction. And he said to Nelson, "Hey, my name is Robert Nesbitt." And Nelson said, "I used to know a Robert Nesbitt. He went to Atlanta to recruit Dr. King to come down to Dexter Avenue Church to be our preacher." So it was kind of a fun introduction. And Nelson Malden told me lots of stories, some of them kind of funny, really personalizes Martin Luther King, and some interesting stories about King's tipping habits. People are often surprised to learn that there were white allies back in the 50s during the boycott. I went up to Asheville, North Carolina to visit Reverend Ray Watley, this gentleman right here with the cane. Ray Watley was a Methodist minister who was basically driven out of town from Montgomery because he was preaching about the evils of segregation from his pulpit. He was also part of an integrated human relations council that used to meet at Dr. King's church in the basement back when hardly anybody knew that was going on. If you're from Alabama, you know Reverend and Mrs. Gratz, Reverend Bob and Jeannie Gratz. If you say one name, you got to say the other. They were always together. They became lifelong friends of my parents. Bob was also on the board of the Montgomery Improvement Association, which is how he met my dad. And they were frequent visitors to our house. They were active in the boycott, which got them in trouble because the Ku Klux Klan tossed bombs at their house on 3 occasions, as I recall. Fortunately, no one was ever injured or killed. The Gratzes had a bunch of kids, and my parents used to tease them about, "Oh, you're really Lutheran? You seem like Catholic," whatever. They used to come and visit our house. We used to play with their kids. And, Bob and Jeannie played with my parents because they loved a good game of pinochle or bridge. Now, back to Claudette Colvin. I went to visit her when she was living in the Bronx a few years ago. And here she's in her living room. She's signing a book. That's not a book she wrote. It's a book someone else wrote about her life. It's a children's book. But I did have her sign a copy of the book for me. She is, she moved to New York because she was ostracized after she got pregnant, and city Black leaders felt that they didn't want her to be the face of their fight against segregation because she was an unwed, pregnant teenager. However, she is, and she always actually felt that Rosa Parks stole her thunder, but she is now starting to get her due. She has had a mention in the congressional record. There is a street in the Bronx named after Claudette Colvin. There's a street in Montgomery named after Claudette. And there's a lot of redevelopment going on in the King Hill neighborhood that Claudette used to live in. When I asked Claudette what she thought about that, she said, "Well, I wonder if they're going to be able to drive the drug dealers out of the neighborhood." Anyway, the new, interesting, fascinating good news is that this past fall, Claudette came to Montgomery and went to family court to petition for the expungement of her record. When she was arrested and the police dragged her off the bus for not giving up her seat, they charged her with disorderly conduct, with assault against a police officer, and violating, segregation code. And ironically, an African-American judge has now cleared her record. So here we are, 66 years after a fight for integrated busing, and Black people no longer have to think about where they can sit on a bus. You don't have to think about it, but I was thinking about it when I went back to Montgomery for I guess it was the 60th anniversary. And this is a vintage bus, and I sat in the front, and it just gave me a really good feeling. So here we are now, 2022. It's almost like we're coming full circle. Claudette has had her record wiped clean. My uncle has a street named after him, and not that street is no longer named after a Confederate president. And I recently was able to track down the widow of Hilliard Brooks, that Black man I was telling you about who was shot and killed by a white police officer. Estelle Brooks says she found out about her husband when a funeral director came to her house and said, you know, a white police officer shot your husband. And he took her to the hospital. And what Estelle tells me is that a nurse at the hospital said, you know, you're going to have to give us go home and get $50 before we can work on your husband. And the doctor told her, do you have any children? You know, you might want to bring them back with you. Estelle was pregnant at the time. She said she heard her husband moaning when she got to the hospital to visit, and she went home. She brought her Hilliard, her son, back. She was pregnant at the time, and when she got back, her husband was dead. So for all these people who, you know, these cases where police officers are shooting unarmed Black men, nobody's thinking about what is happening to the rest of people's family. You're not just killing one person, you're hurting an entire family. So I think we are at a point where we could probably stop and take some questions. Alex?
Perfect. Thank you so much for your presentation. As Susan said, this is a time where if you have a question, you can submit it to our comments, and we'll be able to share them live with her, and she'll be able to answer them for you. But as we wait to see if the audience has any questions, I know I have some. Thank you so much for this presentation. That was this perfect blend of both history and personal story. You talk about some of these big figures of the boycott, but also your family, your parents, your uncle, Fred Gray, who, and another wonderful connection, is a member of the Board of Trustees for the Alabama Department of Archives and History. So, right, this is really a story that hits home for people in Montgomery. So many connections here. But, you know, with this story that is both history and personal, can you talk about the process of researching? How long did it take you to write the book? What was the research process like for you? And I know you mentioned that you came to the Department of Archives and History. So can you talk about some of your work here as well?
Okay. 5 years, Alex, to write the book. I thought I was a journalist. I spent 41 years, you know, writing news. And I thought I could just go out and interview some people and sit down and write up a manuscript and be done. But it was, you know, you've got to think deeper. You've got to, many of the people I interviewed were up in age, and, you know, they were very young in 1955. So it's like 60 some years later. And I interviewed them on camera. I took my video camera and did the interview so that I could go back and see looks on their faces and expressions, and so that I would really get the meat of what they were saying. Mm-hmm. I did research, of course, at the Alabama Department of Archives. I mean, from as little as, you know, what was the weather like on the day of the boycott to I had met Ed Bridges, who was your director emeritus. I met at a One Montgomery meeting, that organization I was telling you about, and he actually mentioned a collection that you had at the archives of letters that had been sent to the City Lines bus company from people all around the country, many of them white supremacists who supported the efforts not to desegregate the buses. And they sent money. They sent letters saying, we support you, you know, send those people back to Africa. It was terrible. But anyway, I was at the time writing some opinion pieces for the Montgomery Advertiser. So I wrote about that, and it was a fascinating collection. The letters were sent to the family of the man who was the manager of the bus company, the Bagleys. And so I actually went and interviewed the Bagley's son and daughter-in-law, and also talked to their daughter about, you know, why they released that information. And they knew that there would be people who would not be happy about the information getting out there, but they just felt it was the right thing to do. I met, let's see, who else did I did the Library of Congress. I mean, they had the Rosa Parks papers were housed there. At the time, they were just available really to researchers, and they have now since been given to the library, and they have made a special Rosa Parks exhibit that's now open to the public, which is fascinating. But I used to get goosebumps there because, you know, there were papers that she had written herself. And, you know, letters to her mom and her friends and her relatives, and signed copy of my uncle's book. You know, it was just, all of that was just really fascinating. I followed my uncle around. He let me tag around because, you know, he's an old guy. He's 91 now. When I wrote the book, he was a little bit younger. And he was going around the country. This before the pandemic. He was people want to hear about his role in the boycott and his incredible career doing many other things and filing cases that have gone to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so I would just tag along with him and my Aunt Carol to where he was getting honorary, you know, life achievement awards and honorary degrees and things like that. So that was a part of it. I interviewed my dad on camera several years before he passed away, to get a lot of those stuff. He had never told me that story about Hilliard Brooks. You know, I mean, they were adults, my uncle and my dad. They didn't share a lot of those stories because they were busy with their lives. And I say it's kind of akin to what was happening with Jewish people who experienced the Holocaust. They came back home, they had their families, they didn't tell their children about the horrors of what had happened. And so my family had kept a lot of that to themselves, and I found out about it as an adult later in life. Long answer to a question.
No, it's a wonderful answer because it really shows just how important that kind of oral history, collecting these stories from the people, how important that is.
Let me just say, now that you bring up oral history, I did leave one thing out. I was at a book signing for Ed Bridges at your archives, Dorothy Moore, Dot Moore, who's kind of been a civil rights activist, a voting rights activist. And I met her and we were talking, and I was telling her I was working on this book, and she said, "Oh, you need to go down the hall to the research room and have them show you the oral histories from Virginia Durr." And so Virginia Durr, you know, the civil rights activist, she was friends with Rosa Parks. She was integrating people. She and her husband, a lawyer, Clifford Durr, was a mentor to my uncle. Anyway, Virginia had interviewed a lot of civil rights activists from locally from Alabama. And I went to your research room, and I put on the headsets and I just listened. I got lost in them and listened to it. She talked to people like Johnny Carr and some other folks. It's fascinating.
No, and to me, something about hearing the voices of people really kind of brings everything. I mean, it's something only obviously you can do for more recent historical subjects. You can't go back to a time before the recorder, but hearing the recordings of them, there's something very powerful about that, and hearing their voices come through. And that's definitely something that comes across both in your presentation, but also in your book, that you're bringing their voices out, as well as incorporating your own perspective in and kind of bringing it all together. And so you were talking about how you didn't know these stories when you were younger. What inspired you to kind of start pursuing the story? Was it that you started hearing more about it and you wanted to hear straight from your family? Like, what happened? Was it what kind of happened first? How did you get on this topic?
Well, I had to write the story because, well, first of all, my Uncle Fred has written the book, Bus Ride to Justice, about the boycott and about his illustrious career. My father, there are all these narratives that came out of that protest. My father, late in his career, when he retired from his position as it was a life appointment as a judge, but my mom had a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, and so he became her caretaker. And he had always felt that the Montgomery boycott was such a pivotal moment that he wanted to write about his own experiences. And he started writing some stories. He took a correspondence writing course, but he passed away before he could finish. And it was as if he had thrown down the mantle. I had to kind of pick it up and then tell his story, but also my story about, how it affected me. And because of what they did really in 55 kickstarted the civil rights movement. It really gave Black people, it was the first big direct action, protest. And it gave a lot of other Black people around the country the courage to do similar things, the freedom rides and integrating the lunch counters in Greensboro and things like that. So I just felt that I had to do it.
Definitely. It's a story. It's an important story to be told. Like you were saying earlier, it's personal and historical all at once. We have a question here from Rebecca Todd Minder. It kind of bounces back to that, where she says, "Great presentation, Mrs. Houston. I've always wondered if you children of the civil rights pioneers stayed connected because of your shared experiences, like Bernice King or Barbara Shores, for example. Did you talk to any kind of other, as she said, the children of these pioneers? Did you talk to any of them as you were writing the book? Have you been in discussion with them about their experiences as well?"
Children, well, yes. I talked to some of those friends and neighbors who lived in my neighborhood. Some of their parents were also drivers and involved in the carpool operation. And they told me some of their stories. They told me some stories. I had to kill some of my babies because I wanted to tell so many stories. And the publisher said, you can't tell them all. But I do remember Frank Taylor telling this story. His father was owned some dry cleaners. And early on, he just had one or two. And he was trying to get some more money and funding. And he and his wife went to the bank to get some money. And that the white banker sat him down in the office and told the husband that, he would have to beg for the money. He made him get down on his knees in the bank office to beg for the cash to fund his dry cleaners. So I, talked to people like them. I talked to the Gratz children. Bob and Jeannie Gratz had a gazillion children, is like we like to say, but we have stayed friends with them over the years. And I did interview Meta had moved from California, a daughter, and down the street from her parents as they were getting older to kind of keep an eye on them. And when I was working on the book, I interviewed Meta. I mean, we were children together, but we talked a lot about what had happened since. And she gave me just has still to this day a vivid recollection of what it was like when the Ku Klux Klan threw bombs at their house. And one year that a bomb was thrown, her parents and a couple of the children had been, and where were they? They were in Tennessee at a place where they were being schooled about how to desegregate the schools and civil rights, activism, blah, blah, blah. And they found out that their house had been bombed, and they went home, and she remembers seeing those big bad policemen who were at her house, because she couldn't relate to, they were white police officers. And I don't know how they were feeling about everything, but she had a vivid recollection of, going to her home and seeing glass shattered all over the floor and everything, a really big mess. And talked about how her mom and dad used to tell them if things were happening that they had to go and hide. So yes, I have been in touch with some of the children of the era, and it was helpful in writing the book.
Definitely, because it's both the perspectives, getting them from the oral histories and from your interviews from kind of the older generation, but also what I find also very interesting about your book and also your presentation is it's also your understanding of how it was, and then taking a step back and saying, all right, now what is the effect of all of this, both for your parents, but also for the kind of larger history of what it meant at the time. So I have another question for you, and this might be our last question unless we get another one from the audience. Next month is Women's History Month, and I was telling you earlier, we have our exhibit right now of Justice Not Favor, Alabama Women and the Vote. where we kind of look at how women were involved in not just voting rights activism, but also at large. And so many of the women or the people who are involved in the Montgomery bus boycott are women. So can you kind of expand and talk more about the role of women in the boycott?
Alex, women played a huge role in the boycott. I mean, you're thinking Rosa Parks. Okay. And now we're learning Claudette Colvin. But there were people like Joanne Robinson and Mary Fair Burks. They were real activists in an organization called the Women's Political Council. And they were both English professors at Alabama State College at the time. And they were, Joanne had a bad experience on a bus herself. It irritated her. And so they started taking notes. I mean, they even had their students in their classes go on buses and document bad situations where, Black people would get on the front and pay their dime fare. And if it was too crowded in the front, the bus driver would make them get off and go around to the side door and get on and sit in the back that way. And they had them taking notes, names of, numbers and names of bus drivers who were mean, to people. So they were actively doing that. And once the boycott got started, I mean, before the boycott, they risked their jobs by mimeographing these notes that they were sending around to churches and to the community announcing that we're going to have, after Rosa Parks was arrested, we're going to have a boycott, stay off the buses tomorrow. So those two people were very active. Then you had, after Claudette was the teenager, refused to get up off this bus or give up her seat, there were other women who have gotten really not enough recognition. Aurelia Browder, who that Supreme Court case was named after, Browder v. Gale, Susie McDonald, Mary Louise Smith, another teenager, she was 18 years old. These were all people who had also, between Claudette and Rosa Parks, refused to give up their seats, who have not gotten enough recognition and in fact should, because it was actually their case that went to the Supreme Court, which overturned segregated busing and segregated seating on the buses. And Rosa Parks, as much of a heroine as she is or was not a part of that case. Her case was a disorderly conduct case that was making its way through the local courts. And my Uncle Fred felt that if they were ever going to have a chance to destroy segregation, they needed to have a federal case. So he filed a separate case with those four women. And that's the one that made it up to the Supreme Court that really made the difference.
Oh, wow. So women are really very central to the story,
oh, yes.
both in action and I'm so glad that you mentioned all these other women, because it's good to have their names out there and to recognize them for what they did and the change that they brought about. So thank you so much for that. But also thank you for coming here today and telling us a little bit more about your book, Daughter of the Boycott. And remember, you can purchase it on our online store. And you can learn more from purchasing it and reading it. And thank you so much for coming.
I'll say one more thing.
Yes, of course.
Because lots of people like to listen to books. This book is now also an audiobook. So for those who don't want to read it on hardcover, you can listen to me tell the story.
Excellent. So it comes in many forms. And so please go out and get it, because it's a wonderful book and you'll learn more stories than what you heard today. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to everyone for joining us virtually. And I hope to see you in person next month. But regardless, it'll be streaming here on our Facebook and YouTube channel. So everyone have a great day.
Thanks, Alex.